Resuming debate, Senator Simons.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. On January 12th, Post Media, the country's largest newspaper chain, released its first quarter fiscal update. The quarter begins in September and ends November 30th, and it has traditionally been the most lucrative one for Canadian newspapers, since it includes the back-to-school period, Black Friday, and the run-up to Christmas. But this quarter, Post Media's numbers were bleak, a net loss of $15.9 million. 12 days later, the other shoe dropped. The company announced that it would be laying off 11% of its editorial staff across the chain. That means paring already gutted newsrooms right down to the bare bone. Those cuts weren't the only blow. Staff at the biggest prairie newspapers, the Edmonton Journal and Edmonton Sun, the Calgary Herald and Calgary Sun, the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix, and the Regina Leader-Post, were told that they would never come back to their once vibrant newsrooms again. The newsrooms have closed. The few staff remaining will work from home, as they have been since the start of this pandemic. The Calgary Herald building, a hilltop landmark, has been sold to U-Haul. It's almost too on the nose to be real. The Saskatoon and Regina buildings are also for sale. Now, Post Media has a complicated lease agreement, which means it can't divest itself of its Edmonton site so easily. So for now, the elegant 5-story building, which sits on one of downtown Edmonton's most historic corners, stands empty and abandoned, a ghostly reminder of the days when newspapers were powerful forces for community and democratic good. And of course, it's not just prairie papers that are in trouble. Post Media papers in St. Thomas, Sarnia, and Owen Sound, Ontario, are now publishing only 3 days a week. And just this week came the parallel announcement that New Brunswick's major papers, the Telegraph Journal, the Moncton Times and Transcript, and the Fredericton Daily Gleaner would be daily no more, publishing only thrice weekly. These papers, like so many across the world, have had their economic model derailed by the digital disruption. Their advertisers, large and small, have moved to online sites, from Craigslist, Kijiji, and AutoTrader to Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Google, and Facebook. And their subscribers have stopped paying, either because they were happy to get their news for free online, or because they could no longer see the value in paying more and more for papers that were shrinking and shrieking each passing year. More than that, local newspapers are facing fierce online competition for their readers' attention. Once upon a time, papers had regional monopolies, not just on advertising, but on our time and our interest. Today, Canadians can access the news of the world in real time, whether their tastes run to The Guardian, Le Monde, and The Washington Post, or to Fox News and the Daily Mail. Whatever your taste, there's a news site for you. You are no longer limited to getting your news from your daily paper, your hometown radio station, or your local supper hour newscast. Meanwhile, new digital competitors are popping up across the country, trying to serve readers who are interested in specific topics or specific points of view. Many of these publish award-winning journalism about the climate, about Parliament, about social and technological issues. But they have a reach and an ecumenicism that cannot match that of the broadsheet daily paper. In some ways, Canadians have never had as many options to be informed. Information from around the world is literally at our fingertips. But in other ways, we have never known less about what is going on in our own cities and towns, without local reporters to cover city council and school board meetings, without local investigative journalists digging into local scandals, without local feature writers telling local stories. So now we have before us Bill C-18, which is designed to throw a lifeline to struggling news sites, large and small, all across the country. The premise is deceptively, intoxicatingly simple. Google and Facebook have lots of money. As Senatrice Nadeau-Deschênes has told us, they have pockets full of it. They dominate the Canadian advertising economy. Indeed, the government estimates that those two companies alone command 80% of Canada's advertising market. And they surely share links to Canadian news sites, links they don't pay for. So why not ask them to pony up to support the newspapers and newscasts and news sites whose advertising revenues have evaporated? The bill requires Facebook and Google to enter into negotiations with news organizations from the very largest to tiny papers with owner-operators to Indigenous and campus radio stations. If they can reach private agreements, they'll be exempted from the bill's provisions. But if those exemptions are not granted, companies will be required to enter into final offer arbitration. It's a tempting proposition, especially when promises are being thrown about that C-18 will force Google and Facebook to pay for 20 or 30, or even, as Senator Harder suggested this week, and it's the first time I've heard that number, a full 35% of the operating costs of Canadian newsrooms. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has, perhaps more modestly, estimated that the program should bring in about $329 million a year. But the idea that we can or should force two American tech giants to underwrite the independent news upon which Canadians rely is a logical and ethical fallacy. The bill seems premised on a core proposition that the reason print media outlets have lost their revenues is that Google and Facebook are somehow stealing news stories and then monetizing them to sell ads. But this is a fundamental misunderstanding of how digital advertising markets work. Facebook's algorithm privileges content that generates engagement. And a story about the Kamloops School Board or a Senate debate isn't sexy or juicy enough to do the job. Sadly, yes. A 2021 study for Neiman Labs found that less than 4% of posts viewed on Facebook actually linked to news stories. And since then, Facebook, pivoting to video to fend off the challenge of TikTok, has retooled its algorithm to show people even less news. Jean-Hugh Roy, a professor of journalism and media economics at Université du Québec à Montréal, UQAM, estimates that Facebook made $198.8 million in revenues stemming from Canadian journalistic content in 2022. But that was actually down from $210 million in 2021. Professor Roy posits that of that sum, about $99 million could be shared with the Canadian news industry. But even that rather rosy estimate will be far from enough to subsidize the costs of newsrooms across the country, and especially not if that sum keeps declining. For its part, Google doesn't post ads on its news site at all. Google News makes no money. It's really there as a loss leader to keep people on the site longer. It's not that Google and Facebook benefit hugely from sharing news. They get little or no direct economic benefit from sharing news content. Now, Google and Facebook are advertising behemoths who dominate the internet and the advertising market with an unrivaled and unprecedented power. According to the Transnational Institute, in 2021, Google was the most visited website in the world, with monthly traffic of 92.5 billion visits. YouTube, which is owned by Google, is the second most visited site, with 34.6 billion monthly visits. Facebook comes third, with 25.5 billion visitors a month. The only Canadian website that ranks in the top 20? Pornhub, with 3.3 billion visitors a month, which gives Pornhub the peculiar distinction of attracting more views than Reddit or Bing. So yes, Google and Facebook have a stranglehold on eyeballs and advertisers. I'm not asking you to sympathize with them. I'm just asking whether it's sensible to demand that they underwrite Canadian newspapers, magazines, broadcasters, and news sites, including tiny websites whose work is almost never shared or indexed on those social media platforms at all. More than that, I'm asking if it's wise. How independent can the Canadian news media be if they are so deeply beholden to the goodwill and the future economic success of two foreign corporations? Back in June of 2021, when we were debating Bill S-225, Senator Quérignon's bill, which had some parallels to C-18, our Transportation and Communications Committee heard from the witness Edward Greenspan, the former editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, who was by then the president and CEO of the Public Policy Forum. Here's what Mr. Greenspan told our committee in 2021, and I quote, "Inviting the platforms to negotiate deals with individual publishers can badly distort the information marketplace. People have expressed concerns for decades that advertisers influence news agendas. In fact, it was rare to find an advertiser that had enough of a market share, more than 1 or 2% of a publisher's total revenues, to do so. In contrast, I can well imagine a platform accounting for 10% or more of a news organization's revenue under this system. They have massive public policy agendas of their own, including tax policy, regulatory oversight, data, etc." End quote. Mr. Greenspan warned us, quote, "You are here to strengthen the independent press, not to create new dependencies." We should heed his advice now. With C-18, we are creating an even greater economic dependence, and we are giving Google and Facebook even more power than they already have over what we read and what we see, and indeed, what we think. The mechanisms proposed in Bill C-18 render us even more vulnerable to their corporate decisions, decisions over which Canadians will have absolutely no control. And as we watch the slow-motion meltdown of Twitter, accelerated this week, it seems to me naive, nay foolhardy, to assume that Google and Facebook will be golden geese whose golden eggs can sustain our free press in perpetuity. If and when Facebook or Google are no longer cool or fashionable or trustworthy, where will that leave us? I have many other questions about this bill as we move towards committee. Realistically, how much will small, rural, ethnocultural, or indigenous papers and radio stations actually benefit from this program, even if they negotiate collectively? How much should we want to subsidize large players such as Rogers or Bell Media, or failing legacy firms like Postmedia, especially if that makes it harder for innovative startups to compete with them? What guarantees do we have that companies will spend their subsidies to increase news coverage as a net increase, as opposed to paying down debt or rewarding their executives? Is it reasonable, as the Parliamentary Budget Officer estimated, for CBC and Radio-Canada, which are already funded by the government, to receive by far the largest share of this new money? What will be the impact on our respect for copyright law and the principles of fair use, and to our obligations under the Berne Convention, given C-18's somewhat cavalier hand-waving away of traditional copyright protocols? And are we comfortable giving unprecedented new regulatory powers to the CRTC to intervene in the business of print journalism and to require mandatory media codes of ethics, given that the free press has never before been subject in any way to the authority of the CRTC? My friends, I was a professional journalist in this country for 30 years. I believe that responsible journalism is essential to the health of a civil society. And so it's easy to look at the crisis in Canadian journalism and exclaim, something must be done. Well, this is something. But what will it actually do? Not, I fear, what we would like. Thank you, merci, and hi-hi.
Senator Deegan, you have a question? Senator
Would my
Deegan, Nova Scotia.
seatmate kindly take a question?
I would be delighted to take a question. We'll pop like Jack in the boxes.
I'm wondering if you thought at all about how new online platforms like the Logic Beta Kit or podcast, investigative journalist platforms that deliver podcasts like Canadaland, how those sorts of models fit into the world that C-18 imagines, because they seem to be fighting their own fight in a dramatically different media landscape. And I'm just wondering if you've contemplated that. Thank you.
Senator Simons.
I have contemplated it long and hard. So here is the challenge. Many of these small independent sites are already struggling for market share, both in terms of readers and advertisers, because they're competing with the legacy dinosaurs, shall we say. So there is a strong argument to be made that if you prop up traditional broadsheet newspapers with a failing business model, you are going to inhibit the capacity of new competitors to come into the marketplace. On the other hand, as I said in my speech, some of those new competitors serve rather niche markets, and they don't give the kind of broad community coverage that a local daily newspaper did. So I'm very torn. And I think those companies are too. I mean, some of them initially came out quite critically of Bill C-18, and the premise that they will have to somehow band together, because there are no newspaper unions in this country. They'll have to find other similarly situated companies and come together as a collective and then go together to negotiate with Facebook and Google. How will they pull those collectives together? Do they have the legal bench strength to go toe-to-toe with two of the world's largest corporations? It's a very interesting question. Now, some of those small publications have already made successful deals with Google, more with Google than with Facebook, but they have made successful deals to showcase their work. Whether those deals are going to get ripped up now, whether Google and Facebook are actually going to be less likely to be supportive is a very good question. We just don't know yet.
Thank you. Sénatrice Miville-Deschênes, vous avez une question pour la sénatrice Simons? Senator Simons, your time is expired. Are you requesting 5 minutes to answer more questions?
I would love to have another 5 minutes with the indulgence of the chamber.
Do we have an agreement for 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Sénatrice Miville-Deschênes, votre question.
Je serai courte. J'admire votre vision assez puriste du journalisme, mais il me semble, vous avez raison de dire qu'il y a des dangers à avoir de l'argent de grandes plateformes qui sont extrêmement puissantes. Mais il me semble que le débat a déjà dépassé cela, puisque le journalisme au Canada reçoit de l'argent du gouvernement. Or, le gouvernement est sans doute au Canada l'entité qui est le plus critiquée, et maintenant elle donne de l'argent aux médias. Donc, en quoi ce serait différent au plan des principes que d'accepter de l'argent de plateformes qui font quand même un peu d'argent avec le journalisme?
Senator Simons.
Bonne question, et je voudrais répondre en français, mais peut-être que c'est mieux pour tout le monde si je fais mes réponses en anglais. C'est plus facile pour moi et peut-être pour toutes les deux. You're right, and I've also been critical of the idea of the government funding journalism through the local journalism fund. It is a very difficult proposition to have an independent press that is reliant on government subsidies, no matter how arm's length that they are. It's also very problematic to have newspapers be so dependent on two corporations instead of on the traditional subscriber base and the traditional advertisers. You know, I've spoken with academics such as Vivek Krishnamurthy at the University of Ottawa, who suggests that the more appropriate model would have been tax credits, very robust and generous tax credits, so that if you subscribe to a Canadian publication, online or in print, you would get money back. And if you were an advertiser and you placed your advertising in your local weekly newspaper or your local daily newspaper or on your local radio station, that you might also get a subsidy back from that. That would allow consumers of news and purchasers of advertising to vote with their eyes and vote with their feet, and have there be a direct correlation between what people want to read and what people want to support, and getting money back from the government, so that sort of, it washes the money like Pontius Pilate. But, we have painted ourselves into this corner. I've spoken recently with publishers of small-town community newspapers who are in despair because one of the bread and butters of their market was that the local town would advertise in the local paper. So if you had a bylaw hearing, if you were announcing some city change, the town bought money in the local town paper. Now they don't do that. They buy a much cheaper ad online, or they don't even buy an ad, they just make a post on Facebook. And as a result, if we don't support our local media, it dies. If we're going to make a choice in this country that we don't care about having local news, then that's exactly what the world will end up with no local news. I met also a couple of weeks ago with Jordan Bidoff, the new owner and publisher of the Toronto Star, a very big name in Toronto's business community, who said he's knocking on the door of the big banks and the big car companies and saying, hey, put your display advertising back in the paper, because if you don't, there won't be a paper. We have choices to make too, and I'm not sure that we've made the right ones.
Senator Wallen?
quick comment, really, in response to some of your comments. Of course, we'll discuss this endlessly at committee, but talking with local newspapers in my area, one of the things that troubles them is that while government, on the one hand, has agreed to pay them money and therefore compromising independence, they have also stopped 100% of their advertising in these local papers, which was a genuine and arm's length source of income. So if they wanted to support these news operations in small communities, they do have a mechanism.
The other mechanism I've heard from small publishers is that they would like changes in the mailing rate that make it easier for them to mail out their weekly papers. They're also really frustrated because Canada Post is out competing them in the flyer business. Now, flyers aren't sexy, but they were the economic backbone of a lot of newspapers, large and small. And what I hear from newspaper publishers is that Canada Post gives such great rates that the newspapers can't compete. Now, Canada Post has a right to compete in the marketplace, but again, we have to consider the consequences of all these decisions.
Senator